The night is thick, an invisible weight hangs in the air. There are moments when life seems like a battlefield where hidden forces act without us being able to understand. The tiredness that doesn't go away, the conflicts that arise out of nowhere, that feeling of being spiritually drained. Have you ever felt something like this? Many believe that these are just coincidences or bad phases, but what if they are not? What if there is something deeper going on behind the scenes in your life? The problem is that we don't always realize what's happening. We feel the attack, but we don't know the source. We try hard, we try to resolve it with our own strength, but it seems like something always pulls us back. Have you ever wondered why certain challenges recur in your life? Why do some battles never seem to end? There is a truth that few know, and it can completely change the way you see these moments. What if I told you that these attacks could be attracting you without you even realizing it? What if, without knowing it, you were leaving doors open to forces that weaken you spiritually? The Bible leaves no doubt. There is a manual to avoid these attacks, but almost no one talks about it. Many people spend their lives suffering without ever understanding that the answer has always been before their eyes, in a book that you may have already read, but never looked into in depth. James's letter holds valuable secrets about how to win this invisible battle. A direct, practical, and straightforward book that exposes truths that may be uncomfortable, but liberating. Tiago not only teaches you how to recognize attacks, but also reveals how to prevent them from happening. The question is, are you ready to face this truth? Because it may require changes that not everyone is willing to make. Many people believe that attacks come out of nowhere, that they are just trials sent by God to test their faith. But what if I told you that, in many cases, these attacks have a specific cause? That it's not just a matter of being strong, but of understanding what loopholes are allowing this to happen. The truth is that the enemy does not attack by chance. He finds space where there is vulnerability. And these vulnerabilities may be much closer than you think. Now, you can choose to continue seeing this as just a difficult phase, or you can open your eyes to a reality that will transform your way of dealing with the spiritual world. If this message has touched you this far, it's because there is something you need to hear. In the next few minutes, you will discover the truth about spiritual attacks and, more importantly, how to protect yourself from them. But first, you need to understand that this war is real and that you are already part of it. If there was a war happening right before your eyes, but invisibly, how would you know you were in the middle of it? Many live without realizing that they are on a battlefield where attacks happen daily. The Bible makes it clear that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces that operate in the shadows. The problem is that because we don't see these attacks, we end up ignoring them until it's too late. Have you ever had moments where everything seemed to go wrong at the same time? Arguments for no reason, unexpected financial problems, illnesses arising without explanation. It may seem like a coincidence, but what if it isn't? Spiritual oppression is real and manifests itself in many ways, often disguised as common problems. This explains why some people always live trapped in the same cycles of failure and suffering without ever being able to free themselves. The Bible is full of accounts of these attacks. Job lost everything suddenly, not by chance, but because there was a spiritual plan behind it. Daniel faced opposition in the visible world, but the real war was taking place in the invisible world. Even Jesus was tempted in the desert, proving that no one is immune to these attacks. What do all these stories have in common? Each of them shows that the enemy acts strategically, looking for openings to attack. But how does this apply to your life? Think about the times when you tried to change something and suddenly everything became more difficult. He began to seek God more, but was overcome by an inexplicable discouragement. He decided to forgive someone, but feelings of anger returned with force. This isn't just emotional. It's a sign that something is trying to stop your transformation. The problem is that many don't recognize these signs and end up giving up before victory arrives. If there is a spiritual war going on, it is essential to know how to protect yourself. Just as a soldier does not go to the battlefield without armor, you cannot face this war without preparation. Ignoring this reality is the same as walking through a storm without shelter. And what happens when you are unprotected? The enemy finds space to act, bringing even more confusion and suffering. But here's the point that few realize. The enemy doesn't always have to attack directly. Often he just waits for you to open the door yourself. Small attitudes, thoughts, and choices can serve as invitations for these attacks. And that's exactly what James talks about. The key to winning this battle is not just defending yourself, but closing the gaps before the enemy can enter. And that's where we come to the crucial point. Many people look for answers to their spiritual difficulties in the wrong places, without realizing that the solution has always been in the Bible, specifically in the letter of James. This book is a true practical manual for Christian living, but few explore its true power. Tiago does not talk about distant theories, but about concrete actions that transform lives. And one of the most impactful truths he reveals is that resistance to the devil begins with submission to God. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. James 4:7. This is not just a nice phrase, but a profound spiritual strategy. Many try to resist the enemy, but fail because they ignore the first part of the verse, subjection to God. Without this foundation, any attempt at resistance will be weak and ineffective. It's like trying to build a wall without a solid foundation. Sooner or later, everything falls apart. James also warns of an uncomfortable truth. Spiritual attacks often come not just from without, but from within. Everyone is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own lust. James 1:14. In other words, the disordered desires within us create the gaps that allow the enemy to enter. This explains why some people constantly struggle with the same problems. They don't realize that the root of the problem lies within themselves. And how does this manifest itself in real life? Someone who struggles with anxiety may be fueling this problem with negative news and catastrophic thoughts. A person who feels spiritually weak may be neglecting their prayer life. Small daily choices that seem harmless can be opening doors to spiritual oppression. James teaches us that if we want to win this war, we need to identify these gaps and close them quickly. This truth changes everything because it means we are not defenseless in the face of spiritual attacks. If spiritual problems find a way in, then we can also close that way in. But this requires something that many avoid: self-analysis and change. Without recognizing our own faults, we remain vulnerable. James invites us to stop blaming the enemy for everything and start taking responsibility for our own spiritual lives. And here comes the question that few ask. What would happen if, instead of just fighting the enemy, we stopped him from even getting closer? This is the forgotten key that James reveals. Resisting the devil is important, but submitting to God is what really protects us. And now that this truth is exposed, the question remains, what are the open doors that you haven't noticed yet? Many people believe that spiritual attacks happen randomly, as if they were helpless victims of an invisible battle. But the truth is that the enemy does not attack for no reason. He needs a loophole, a legality. James shows us that many of these doors are opened by ourselves, often without realizing it. Pride, disobedience, unforgiveness, and even small concessions can become invitations to spiritual oppression. Demons don't attack by chance. They find legality. This phrase may seem harsh, but it is spiritual reality. If someone harbors resentment against another person, that feeling turns into an open door. If a person insists on living a life of lies or deceit, he gives the enemy the right to act. And James 3:16 makes this clear: where there is envy and factionalism, there is confusion and all kinds of evil. In other words, certain attitudes not only weaken us spiritually, but also attract problems. A simple example of this is someone who wants peace in their home, but is always involved in gossip and intrigue. Or someone who asks for prosperity, but lives with envy of other people's success. These contradictions create a perfect environment for spiritual attacks. When we ignore biblical principles and follow our own desires, we are unknowingly signing a contract for negative forces to gain access to our lives. The issue here is not just protecting yourself from attacks, but understanding why they happen. Imagine a house full of open windows in the middle of a storm. You can try drying the floor repeatedly, but as long as the windows remain open, water will keep coming in. This is how the spiritual world works. Closing the gaps is more effective than simply fighting the consequences. And how to identify these open doors? Self-analysis is fundamental. What negative patterns are repeated in your life? What sins do you justify rather than eliminate? What areas always seem to be under attack? These questions are not easy, but answering them could be the difference between continuing to suffer or finally achieving freedom. Many avoid this process because it requires humility and change. But James gives us the key to closing these doors, recognizing our faults and aligning them with God. Now that this truth has been exposed, a new question arises. What if there was a practical way to protect yourself against these attacks? If closing the loopholes is the first step, what would be the next? Knowing that there are open doors is just the first step. What really matters now is to close them permanently. James 4:8 gives us a clear path. Draw close to God, and He will draw close to you. This means that the closer we are to God, the more protected we will be against spiritual attacks. But this approach requires action. It's not enough to just want an armored life. It is necessary to build spiritual habits that strengthen the soul and eliminate vulnerabilities. Prayer, fasting, and renewal of the mind are indispensable tools. Just as a soldier prepares before battle, a Christian must equip himself spiritually. Romans 12:2 teaches us that we must transform our minds, rejecting negative patterns and aligning ourselves with God's will. This involves practical changes, better selecting what we consume, avoiding toxic environments, and above all, monitoring our own thoughts and attitudes. Spiritual vigilance is essential. Many people fall because they underestimate small mistakes, thinking they don't make a difference. But the truth is that big defeats start with subtle concessions. A negative thought nurtured, an unresolved hurt, a justified wrong choice. It is in these details that gaps form. Therefore, James reinforces that resisting the devil is not just saying no to him, but living a life of obedience to God. A practical strategy for strengthening this resistance is to create a solid spiritual routine. Setting aside time to pray every day, meditating on the Word, and fasting regularly are effective ways to keep your mind and spirit strengthened. Just as a gym strengthens the body, spiritual discipline strengthens the soul. And the stronger you are spiritually, the less vulnerable you become to external attacks. Another crucial point is self-knowledge. The person who wants to protect themselves needs to identify their biggest weaknesses. Someone who struggles with anxiety, for example, needs to redouble their vigilance about negative thoughts. Anyone who has difficulty forgiving should invest in studying forgiveness and liberation. Ignoring fragile areas is like walking around with a shield full of cracks. Sooner or later, the enemy will find an entry point. Now that we understand how to close the gaps and strengthen ourselves spiritually, a fundamental question arises. What happens when we resist the devil? Does he really run away? And how does this resistance manifest itself in practice? Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. This phrase, so short and direct, carries a powerful principle. Resistance generates victory. But resisting is not just an isolated act of saying no to sin or evil influences. It is a continuous state of firmness, a life posture based on obedience and faith. Many people try to resist evil but fail because they do so with their own strength, without seeking support from God. And that's when the fight becomes exhausting and ineffective. The enemy's great trap is to make a person believe that he has more power than he really does. But the truth is that its strength lies only in the gaps we leave open. When a Christian submits fully to God, spiritual resistance becomes a natural consequence. Imagine a well-built wall. No matter how much the wind blows, it remains firm. The same happens when life is based on the Word. The devil can try, but he finds no room to act. In the Bible, we see clear examples of this principle. Jesus, when tempted in the desert, resisted using the Word of God itself. He did not attempt to argue, negotiate, or use force of his own. He simply stated the truth and stood firm. Likewise, Paul faced countless trials and persecutions, but he never gave up his faith. The secret of resistance is not in fighting with human weapons, but in strengthening yourself spiritually. Faith and identity in Christ are fundamental in this battle. Many people live trapped in fears and insecurities because they don't understand who they really are in God. But when someone understands that they are a son of the Most High, heir of the promises and clothed with spiritual authority, their posture changes. Stop acting like a victim and start living like a winner. And this change of mentality is the key to definitively driving away the enemy. Another common mistake is fighting alone. Spiritual resistance is not a solitary path. Just as soldiers do not go to war alone, a Christian needs to be surrounded by people who share the same faith and purpose. Having communion, seeking advice, and actively participating in a community strengthens the soul and makes resistance even more effective. After all, an isolated coal goes out quickly, but together with others it keeps the flame burning. Now that we understand how resistance works, a crucial question arises. What's the point of knowing all this and not taking action? Knowledge without action is useless. So how do you turn this understanding into real change? Knowing the truth is not enough. What really transforms a life is action. Now that it is clear how spiritual attacks work and how to defend yourself, the inevitable question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Many hear, understand, but leave it for later. But time doesn't wait, and every day of inaction is one more opportunity for the enemy to act. Change begins the moment the decision is made. But is everyone really willing to leave their comfort zone? The first step is to identify the gaps. What are the habits, thoughts, and behaviors that are opening doors for the enemy? It can be something seemingly harmless, like holding a grudge, harboring negative thoughts, or living in spiritual superficiality. But it's these small concessions that create cracks in the foundation. James warned about this. Where there is envy and factionalism, there is confusion and all kinds of evil. Self-deception is dangerous. Looking at yourself honestly is the beginning of transformation. After identifying the gaps comes the hardest part, eliminating them. And that requires real commitment. It's not enough to just want to change. Practical measures need to be taken. If the problem is pride, start exercising humility. If it's addiction, seek help. If it is a lack of communion with God, establish a routine of prayer and Bible study. Small, consistent attitudes generate gigantic changes over time. What can you do today to close these doors? Strengthening communion with God is not optional. It is a vital necessity. Praying without ceasing, fasting, renewing your mind with the Word, surrounding yourself with good influences. All of this is part of building unshakable resistance. Many suffer because they neglect this daily connection. But when the Spirit is strengthened, even the biggest storms become opportunities to grow. The secret of victory is not in the absence of struggles, but in the inner strength to face them. Finally, a challenge: commit to this change. It is not enough to just absorb this knowledge. It needs to be put into practice. Write down on paper the areas of your life that need to be transformed. Set spiritual goals. Look for someone you trust to be accountable for your growth. What is not measured does not improve. God always responds to those who take a serious position. And now, will you just reflect or finally act? The answer to this question will determine the direction of your spiritual life. But there is still one more essential thing before ending this journey. After everything that has been revealed here, one thing is clear. You can no longer allow yourself to be an easy target. Now that you know the enemy's strategies and the means to protect yourself, the responsibility is in your hands. Many continue to suffer simply because they ignore truths like these. But you don't need to be one more. You have the choice to take action today. Close the gaps and strengthen your spiritual life. After all, what's the point of knowing the truth and not putting it into practice? Each teaching shared here could be the key to transforming not only your life, but that of many other people. Think for a moment. How many friends or family members are facing battles without even understanding what is happening? How many are stuck in cycles of pain, doubt, and spiritual failure? If this message opened your eyes, it can do the same for them. So, share this content with someone who needs to hear this truth. And now I want to hear from you. Which of these areas spoke to your heart the most? Which of these gaps have you identified in your life and decided to close from today? Leave your comment here. Your answer may inspire others to make the same decision. And more than that, it can be an important step for you to commit to the change you want to see in your life. Don't underestimate the power of simple positioning. If you've made it this far, you've already taken a big step. But this is just the beginning. To continue learning more about this subject and strengthening your spiritual journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This way you will be notified whenever new content is published. Transformation happens for those who persist in learning and daily practice. Are you ready for this commitment? The spiritual journey is made up of daily decisions. You can choose to remain vulnerable, or you can choose to grow and become stronger. And now that you have this knowledge, what are you going to do with it? That's the question only you can answer.